Saguaro cacti at dusk. A highway cutting into silence so complete you can hear the heat. A canyon rim dissolving into shadow so deep it looks like the edge of the world. Arizona is supposed to be beautiful. And it is. It really, genuinely is. Right up until it isn't. 10 people. 10 places across this state that you've heard of. Highways, overlooks, suburbs, rivers, mountains. 10 disappearances that still don't have answers. Lock your doors. Pull up a map. Let's get into it. If you're new here, subscribe. New cases every week. December 2009, Apache Junction, Arizona. 60 miles east of Phoenix, at the edge of a wilderness that has been swallowing people for over a century. A Jeep sits at a trailhead with a cold engine and nobody inside it. It has been sitting there for days. The man who drove it here is gone. His name was Jesse Capen. He was 35 years old. He worked the night shift at the Sheraton Denver Downtown Hotel. A bellhop, 11 consecutive years, never missed a single shift. His co-workers called him a gentle giant, soft-spoken, reliable, the kind of employee who became furniture in the best possible way. Always there, always steady, never a problem. His mother knew him as devoted. His friends knew him as quiet. Nobody, by every account that has ever been given about this man, had any reason to worry about Jesse Capen. Except that nobody actually knew Jesse Capen. Not completely. When his family entered his apartment in Denver after he disappeared, they found over 100 books. Maps, dozens of them. Some hand-drawn and annotated in Jesse's own careful handwriting, some photocopied from library sources, some purchased from specialty shops. All of them were about the same thing, the Lost Dutchman's mine. A legendary gold mine rumored to be buried somewhere deep in the Superstition Mountains of Arizona. A mine whose location has never been confirmed. A mine that may not even exist in the form the legend describes. A mine that has been pulling people into that specific stretch of Arizona wilderness for more than 100 years, and has never once let a single person find it. Jesse had been researching it for years. Not casually, obsessively, systematically, with the kind of sustained focus that takes real discipline to maintain in secret. He had never mentioned the mine to his mother, never mentioned it to his co-workers, never brought it up with friends. Files recovered from his computer after his disappearance confirmed that he had already made at least 2 prior solo trips to the Superstitions, planned, executed, and completed without telling a single person where he had been. He had a double life, and it had been running parallel to his visible one for years. This was, as far as investigators could reconstruct, his 3rd trip, possibly his 4th, possibly more. In late November 2009, Jesse did several things in sequence that, in retrospect, read like a man preparing for something he knew might not go the way he planned. He saved up his vacation time. He traded in his regular car for a Jeep, better suited to desert terrain. He packed a full month's worth of supplies. He told his mother he was going camping in Arizona and that he would call regularly. Then he drove 15 hours south from Denver to Apache Junction, Arizona, alone, and checked into the Apache Junction Motel to use as a base of operations. He was methodical about it. He made day trips into the mountains from the motel, returning each evening to restock and plan. He stopped at the Superstition Mountain Museum. He bought books and cold drinks at the Bluebird Mine General Store in town, chatting briefly with the staff. To anyone watching, he looked like exactly what he said he was. A tourist with an interest in local history, doing it properly, taking his time. Nobody flagged anything. Nobody had any reason to. The Superstition Wilderness covers 160,200 acres of volcanic terrain in the Tonto National Forest. It is not a place that forgives mistakes. The landscape is rugged in the specific way that means it can kill you from multiple directions. Mountain lions move through the backcountry regularly. Abandoned mine shafts from the 1800s open in the earth with no markings, no fencing, no warning. The canyon walls drop without transition. Crevasses hide beneath brush. There is no cell signal anywhere in the wilderness. The elevation at Tortilla Mountain, which appears to have been Jesse's primary target area, peaks at 4,892 feet. And in early December, the weather in the Superstitions does not behave like the Arizona desert people picture when they imagine the state. It storms, it gets cold, it gets dangerous fast. December 3rd, 2009. Jesse went into the mountains and did not come back to his motel room. Now this is where the case turns dark. That same night and into December 4th, a severe storm system moved through the Superstition Mountains. Lightning, high sustained winds, heavy rain that came in sideways. Jesse had set up a base camp near the old Tortilla Ranch area, a tent pitched in the terrain he had been working through on his day trips. When that camp was eventually found by investigators, the tent had been completely flattened by the storm. Here's what doesn't make sense. There was no evidence Jesse had ever slept in it. No impression in the ground pad, no disturbed sleeping bag, nothing that indicated he had settled in for the night before the storm hit. Whatever had happened, whether he never made it back to camp, whether he had left again before dark, whether he had been caught out in the mountains when the weather turned, he had not been in that tent when the storm came through. 2 weeks later, Jesse still had not returned to his motel room. His mother, growing worried after the phone calls he had promised stopped coming, contacted the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. Deputies located his Jeep at a trailhead and found the abandoned campsite nearby. And what they found inside the tent and in the Jeep is the detail that changes the entire texture of this case. His wallet, his credit cards, his cash, his iPod, his food supply, his water. Every piece of survival equipment he had brought with him. Everything that stood between Jesse Capen and the desert had been left behind. He had walked into the Superstition Mountains carrying nothing that would keep him alive. On December 23rd, the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office launched a formal search operation. Search dogs were brought in. Deputies swept the terrain on foot. A helicopter made passes above the search area. They found boot tracks near the campsite. But the storms of December 3rd and 4th had already destroyed them. The rain had washed the tracks into the ground, making them impossible to follow more than a few yards. After days of intensive searching involving trained search and rescue personnel, search dogs, and aerial support, investigators found no trace of Jesse Capen. Not a scrap of clothing, not a dropped piece of gear, not a footprint they could follow. The mountains had absorbed him completely, and that should have been the end of the trail. Except it wasn't. Here's the critical detail, the one that rewrites the entire timeline and makes this case stranger than it first appears. In December 2011, 2 full years after Jesse disappeared, a hiker reached the summit of Tortilla Mountain, elevation 4,892 feet, and found a glass jar wedged into a rock formation near the top. Inside the jar was a folded note. The hiker opened it. The note read, Colorado, Jesse Capen, December 4th, 2009. Jesse Capen had been alive and mobile on the summit of Tortilla Mountain on December 4th, 2009. The morning after the storm. He had climbed to the top of a nearly 5,000-foot mountain in post-storm conditions with no supplies and left proof that he had been there. He was alive. He was moving. He had made it to the top. And then, somewhere between that summit and the bottom of that mountain, he had ceased to exist. The Superstitions search and rescue team had been working the area nearly every single weekend for those 2 years, at Jesse's mother's personal request. She had asked them to keep looking, and they had kept their word across dozens of return trips, combing the same terrain over and over with fresh eyes each time, updating their search grids, trying new approaches. In November 2012, 3 years after Jesse disappeared, they found something on the southern slope of Tortilla Mountain, a day pack sitting on the terrain near a cliff face. Inside it, Jesse's GPS unit, his camera, and his driver's license. Searchers looked up along the cliff above where the pack was sitting. They spotted a boot, visible on a ledge higher up. And then, wedged into an inaccessible crevasse approximately 30 feet off the ground, a crack in the rock so tight and so awkwardly positioned that it had been missed across 3 years and 20-plus search operations. They found Jesse Capen's skeletal remains. He had been half a mile from his campsite, half a mile from his Jeep, his water, his wallet, everything that could have saved him. The official assessment, though not formally confirmed as cause of death in all documentation, was that Jesse had most likely fallen from the cliff face above the crevasse and become wedged into the crack during the fall. DNA testing confirmed his identity in January 2013. But here's what still has no clean answer and probably never will. Why was a 35-year-old man without supplies climbing 30 feet up a sheer cliff face in the aftermath of a storm? He had left a note on the summit. He had his GPS and camera in a day pack. He was moving deliberately, not panicking. Was he navigating to a specific site he had mapped in secret? One of the locations from those hundreds of books and hand-drawn maps that nobody in his life had known about? Was he trying to get to high ground for a GPS signal? Was he disoriented by the storm and the darkness? Officially, it is unknown. It will likely remain unknown. What is known is this: a man spent years hiding an obsession so consuming that it filled his apartment with over 100 books and drove him to a wilderness 1,500 miles from home at least twice before anyone ever knew. He walked into a mountain range that had already killed people. He left behind everything that could have kept him alive. He survived a storm, climbed almost to the top of a 4,892-foot peak, and left a note in a jar to prove he had been there. And then a search team that refused to give up, that kept going out every single weekend for 3 years because his mother asked them to, found him wedged in a crack in the rock that nobody had looked twice at in 36 months of searching, half a mile from where he started. The Superstition Mountains had kept him for 3 years and given back almost nothing. And that, as you are about to find out, is not even the strangest thing that has happened on this exact stretch of Arizona wilderness. Jesse Capen, at least, went into those mountains on purpose. He planned it, researched it, drove 15 hours for it. The next person to vanish from these same mountains was just stopping to watch a sunset on the way home from work. His uncle looked away from a roadside sign for a moment, and when he looked back, his nephew was simply not there. August 12th, 2020. Milepost 203, State Route 88, Apache Junction, Arizona. It was a Wednesday. The temperature that day had peaked at 113 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of heat that doesn't ease when the sun starts dropping, that just settles differently, pressing down through dusk into the dark. The Superstition Mountains were lit up orange and gold on the western face. From the right angle, at the right moment, they looked extraordinary. Kaiman Welch was 25 years old. He was a tattoo artist, quiet, reserved, the kind of person who expressed himself through his work rather than his words. He was covered in tattoos himself, ink that told stories he mostly kept close. His mother, Rhiannon Lee Wallen, described him in the specific way that only mothers can. Not just as a good person, but as someone whose goodness had a particular quality to it. An amazing soul, she said. A heart of gold underneath all that ink. There was nobody in the world, she told reporters later, who didn't love him. He was close with family in the way some quiet people are. Not demonstrative, not loud about it, just consistently there. He talked mainly to his mother and to his uncle, Brian Welch. Brian was something of a father figure in Kaiman's life. The kind of relationship built over years of showing up for each other in small ways. On August 12th, the two of them had spent the day working together on an AC installation job out at Tortilla Flat, a small historic settlement tucked into the canyon road east of Apache Junction, maybe 20 minutes further into the mountains. It was hot, physical work in brutal conditions. By the time they packed up and pointed the vehicle back toward the city, both men were ready to be done with the day and get home. On the drive back, somewhere along State Route 88, Brian pulled over at the Weaver's Needle Vista. Milepost 203. It is a designated scenic overlook, a paved pullout with a guardrail, a mounted sign explaining the view. The kind of legitimate tourist stop that hundreds of people use every week. From the pullout, on a clear evening, you can see Weaver's Needle in the distance. The famous volcanic rock spire that rises out of the Superstition wilderness about 3 miles in, shaped like a fang against the sky. Kaiman wanted to watch the sun go down over it. A 2-minute stop. The kind of thing you do on a long drive home when the view is good and there's no reason not to. The two of them got out of the vehicle together. They walked to the interpretive sign at the edge of the pullout. Brian turned to read it. When he turned back, Kaiman was not there. No sound, no footsteps fading into the brush. No shout, no signal, no indication of direction. Just not there. Brian called out. He checked around the vehicle, along the guardrail, back toward the road in both directions. Nothing. He waited, thinking Kaiman had maybe stepped behind a rock or wandered a few feet further along the overlook. Minutes passed. The sun finished dropping. It got dark fast the way desert dark does. Complete, sudden, total. The temperature was still well above 100 degrees. And at some point in those first terrible minutes, Brian Welch understood that something had gone deeply wrong, and he called the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. Here's the critical detail, and it is the one that frames everything that followed. Kaiman's cell phone was in the vehicle. His wallet was in the vehicle. He had no water on him, no food, no flashlight, nothing. Whatever happened in that moment at the overlook, whatever Kaiman decided, or whatever happened to him, he had stepped away from a paved road into one of the most dangerous wilderness environments in the continental United States, carrying absolutely nothing that would keep him alive in 113-degree desert heat. The Superstition wilderness begins essentially the moment you step past that guardrail. One step off the pavement and you are in 2.9 million acres of Tonto National Forest. Unmapped mine shafts, mountain lions, No trails, no cell signal. Terrain that drops and rises without warning. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office responded that same night and launched an immediate search. Within hours, they had deployed tracking dogs, horseback riders, and a helicopter equipped with forward-looking infrared thermal imaging cameras. The kind of technology designed specifically to find a human heat signature in darkness. The thermal helicopter swept the terrain east and south of the pullout, covering the most likely directions of travel, and came back with nothing usable. Investigators explained the problem afterward. In August, after a day where the ground temperature has been absorbing direct Arizona sun for 14 hours, the desert floor retains so much ambient heat that the thermal cameras cannot reliably distinguish a human body's warmth from the ground beneath it. The technology that is supposed to cut through darkness had been neutralized by the same conditions that made the search so urgent in the first place. The scent dogs also returned nothing useful. No trail picked up, no direction of travel confirmed. Kaiman had been at that pullout, and then he hadn't, and the desert had offered no indication of which way he went. Over the next 8 days, the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office ran a full-scale operation across the surrounding terrain. The conditions were extraordinary and not in a good way. Temperatures hit at 115 degrees Fahrenheit the day after Kaiman disappeared, tying or breaking records across the East Valley. Searchers were being pulled back from the field by mid-morning on multiple days because the heat had crossed the threshold where it was unsafe for the people doing the searching. Horseback teams, drone operators, deputies on foot, volunteer hikers, all of them working shifts around the temperature, pushing as far as they could before the heat made further movement dangerous, then pulling back and returning at the margins of the day when it was fractionally more survivable. 8 days of that, across 2.9 million acres of terrain that actively resists being searched, they found nothing. Not a boot print, not a thread from Kaiman's black Ghostbusters t-shirt, not a single physical trace. But here's what doesn't make sense. And this detail matters more than almost anything else in the timeline. 7 days into the search, a wildfire ignited in the Superstition Mountains approximately 2 miles east of the Weaver's Needle Vista. The Superstition Fire. It burned 2,664 acres before anyone contained it. And when it started, containment was at 0%. Search teams operating in the corridor, most likely to contain evidence or remains, were pulled back entirely. The terrain that Kaiman had most plausibly entered on the night of August 12th was now on fire. Whatever the desert floor might have preserved across that first week of searching, a footprint, a piece of clothing, any physical marker of which way he had gone, was now subject to 2,664 acres of wildfire 1 week after he vanished. A man disappears without a trace. 7 days later, a fire burns the most likely search area in the Superstition Mountains, the same mountains that kept Jesse Capen's remains hidden for 3 years. The same wilderness where, as we'll get to later in this episode, multiple other people have vanished without explanation. The coincidence of the fire is not evidence of anything. It is documented as an unrelated natural event. But the timing is the kind of thing that you sit with. Detectives obtained a warrant for Kaiman's computer and reviewed his digital history in the days leading up to August 12th. What they found were searches related to suicide. The lead detective on the case, speaking publicly about the investigation, was careful and specific about one distinction. Kaiman had not searched for methods of suicide. The searches were related to the subject broadly, not to a plan. That distinction matters, and the detective made sure to state it on record. But the existence of those searches, combined with what Rhiannon had already shared about the weeks before August 12th being difficult ones for her son, about a family that knew he was working through something without understanding the full weight of it. Those details don't disappear just because the detective drew a careful line around them. Kaiman's mother told reporters in the months after his disappearance that she could barely look at his photographs. Not because she had stopped loving him or had given up, but because of the specific, unresolvable trauma of not knowing. A piece of her soul is missing, she said. And there is nowhere to put that grief. Because grief, without an answer, has no end point. You can't close a door that won't latch. A group of valley hikers who had followed the case began organizing their own volunteer search efforts, heading out to milepost 203 on weekends and holidays, combing terrain that the official search had covered and terrain it hadn't, documenting everything, reporting back to the lead detective. Months passed, then a year, then another. As of 2024, the case remains open. No remains have been found. No evidence has been recovered that confirms what happened after Kaiman stepped away from that overlook sign. The fire burned. The desert kept its silence. The case sits exactly where it was on the night of August 12th. 2020, open, unanswered, incomplete. A black Ghostbusters t-shirt, black jeans, black leather army-style boots. No water, no phone, no wallet. A 2-minute stop at a scenic overlook on the way home from a long day of work, with his uncle standing 10 feet away. A sunset over the Superstition Mountains, and then nothing. Not a thread, not a boot print, not a trace across 2.9 million acres of desert that has had nearly 5 years now to give something back. It hasn't. Kaiman vanished in the time it takes to read a roadside sign. 1 second there, the next second not. With a witness present, with search teams in the air within hours, with every advantage a modern search operation can offer. The next case is older and stranger, and the thing they left behind makes the absence so much worse. Because at least with Kaiman, there was no physical object that said, they were here, and then they weren't. Glenn and Bessie Hyde left an entire boat, 20 feet long, fully loaded, every supply strapped down, floating, alone in the inner gorge of the Grand Canyon, and they were nowhere. October 20th, 1928. Green River, Utah. A young couple drags a homemade wooden boat to the edge of the water and pushes off into the current. They are newlyweds. They are ambitious in the particular way that people are when they are young and in love, and absolutely certain that the thing they are about to do is going to change their lives. They have a plan, a timeline, a goal, and each other. The river is cold and wide and moving fast. They get in anyway. Their names are Glenn and Bessie Hyde, and in 59 days, both of them will be gone without a trace. Glenn was 29 years old, Idaho-born, raised outdoors, the kind of man who built things with his hands because he wanted to understand how they worked. He had constructed the boat himself, a 20-foot wooden sweep scow, flat-bottomed and heavy, the traditional craft of serious river runners in that era. He had already rafted the Salmon and Snake Rivers back home in Idaho, and knew how to read a current, how to position a boat in a rapid, how to make decisions on moving water in real time. He was not reckless. He was experienced. He had earned the right to be confident on a river, and he knew it. Bessie was 22, an aspiring artist, bohemian in the way of the late 1920s, drawn to poetry and theater, and the idea of a life that didn't look like everyone else's. She had been technically married to another man, when she met Glenn on a passenger ship traveling to Los Angeles in 1927. They fell in love across the water. She filed for divorce. It was finalized on April 11th, 1928. She married Glenn the next day. Their relationship had moved at the speed of people who have decided not to waste time. And the honeymoon they were now embarking on reflected that same philosophy entirely. The plan was this: paddle the Green and Colorado rivers from Green River, Utah, all the way to Needles, California, the full length of the Grand Canyon, 277 miles of some of the most violent whitewater in North America. If they made it, Bessie would become the first documented woman to run the canyon in its entirety. Glenn would set a new speed record for the journey. And when they returned home, they planned to leverage what they had done into something. Lecture tours, book deals, a public life built on having accomplished something genuinely historic. They were not just going on an adventure, they were making a calculated bet on their own future. By most accounts, the first leg of the trip went well. They made good time moving through the canyon system. They were adequately provisioned. Glenn's experience on the water showed. They navigated rapids that would have stopped less prepared travelers, and they kept moving. People they encountered along the way reported them in good spirits. Bessie was learning the river as they went, building experience rapid by rapid. The canyon was doing what it always does, imposing itself on the people moving through it, and they were holding their own against it. In mid-November, roughly halfway through the route, Glenn and Bessie made a planned stop. They hiked up the Bright Angel Trail, one of the Grand Canyon's main corridors from the river to the south rim, to resupply before the final stretch. The lower canyon ahead of them was the hardest part of the route. They needed food and gear, and the rim was the place to get it. They hiked up, restocked, and spent some time at the top before heading back down. At the south rim in 1928, one of the most prominent fixtures was a photography studio operated by brothers Emery and Ellsworth Kolb, positioned right at the Bright Angel Trailhead. The Kolbs were fixtures of Grand Canyon life, experienced, knowledgeable, deeply familiar with the river below. The Hydes stopped at the studio. They were photographed. They talked with Emery Kolb at length. And in that conversation, several things happened that every subsequent account of this case has returned to. Because in retrospect, they read like warnings that nobody acted on. Emery Kolb looked at Glenn's scow and asked about life jackets. Glenn laughed. They weren't necessary, he said. Kolb, who had spent years on the Colorado and understood precisely what the lower canyon could do to a boat and the people in it, did not push the point. He also noticed something about Bessie. She seemed hesitant, reluctant to descend back into the canyon. Whether it was accumulated exhaustion from weeks on the water, genuine fear of the rapids ahead, or something more specific that she hadn't said aloud, Kolb sensed that she did not want to get back in that boat. Glenn, by contrast, was fixed on the timeline. They were more than halfway through. They had come too far to stop now. The record was within reach. Kolb's photographer friend Adolphe Sutro agreed to walk back down with the Hydes for the first few miles after they returned to the river. A brief companionable send-off to Hermit Rapid. He was, as far as anyone has been able to establish, the last person who saw Glenn and Bessie Hyde alive. But before they left, there was a moment. Emery Kolb's young daughter was nearby, a little girl in a neat, clean outfit, well dressed in the way of a child whose life was settled and safe and ordinary. Bessie looked at her. She looked at the girl's shoes, and she said quietly, to no one in particular, "I wonder if I shall ever wear pretty shoes again." She never did. November 18th, 1928. Glenn and Bessie Hyde walked back down to the Colorado River, got into their scow, shoved off into the current, and disappeared around the bend. Adolph Sutro watched them go from the bank. The canyon walls closed back around the water. The river kept moving. Now this is where the case turns dark. Glenn's father, R.C. Hyde, had been told to expect the couple in Needles, California by December 6th. That date came and went. No telegram, no call, no word of any kind from Glenn or Bessie. R.C. waited a few more days, allowing for river delays, and then began making inquiries. By mid-December, with still no contact, he traveled to the Grand Canyon himself and began organizing a search with Emery Kolb's help. On December 19th, a search plane flew the inner gorge of the Grand Canyon, tracking the Colorado River downstream from where the Hydes were last known to have been. The pilot found something near River Mile 237, approximately 45 miles from the end of the canyon, floating in the current. It was the Hydes scow. When the ground search party reached the boat, the scene that greeted them is the one that has defined this case for nearly 100 years. The scow was floating upright. It was intact. Every supply the Hydes had brought was still aboard, still strapped down exactly as they had packed it. Bessie's journal was there. Her camera was there. The food, the clothing, the equipment, everything in its place, undisturbed, as though the couple had simply stepped ashore for a few minutes and intended to be right back. Glenn and Bessie Hyde were not there. They were not on the nearby banks. They were not upstream. They were not anywhere that weeks of searching could find them. Here's the critical detail, the one that separates this case from a simple drowning and turns it into something that has occupied historians and river runners and true crime researchers for nearly a century. The boat was not damaged. It had not been capsized. There was no broken rigging, no displaced cargo, no indication that it had experienced any violent encounter with the river. When a sweep scow hits a major rapid and capsizes, particularly in the granite-choked corridor near River Mile 232, which experienced river historians have identified as the most likely site of whatever happened. The evidence shows. The boat shows it. This boat showed nothing. It looked like it had been deliberately parked in the middle of the Grand Canyon and left there. That detail has never been explained. Bessie's journal survived in perfect condition aboard the scow, and when investigators read it, the entries added a layer of complexity that only deepened the mystery. The last journal entry was dated November 30th, near Diamond Creek at approximately River Mile 226. The last photograph recovered from the camera had been taken near Mile 165, probably around November 27th. What this means is that the Hydes had continued traveling for at least 12 days after their last confirmed sighting on November 18th. They were alive well into the final days of November. They made it further down the canyon than the initial search had assumed. And then, somewhere between Diamond Creek and Mile 237, in a 12-mile stretch of river, they ceased to exist entirely. Their bodies have never been found. No physical trace of either person has ever been recovered from the Colorado River or the canyon walls. 2 people, a 20-foot boat, weeks of supplies, a journal, a camera. The boat came back. They did not. Subscribe if you want to keep following cases like this. We go deep every single week. The search was eventually called off. R.C. Hyde returned home without his son. The case was left open because there was no answer to close it with. And over the years that followed, the silence around Glenn and Bessie Hyde began to fill with theories, some reasonable, some extraordinary, and at least one that is so strange it almost demands to be true, even though the evidence says otherwise. Because the questions don't stop with the intact boat and the missing bodies. They start there. And where they lead is somewhere much stranger than a simple drowning on a November river in 1928. The theories started almost immediately, and they have never really stopped. The most straightforward explanation, the one that most Grand Canyon historians and river experts have accepted as the most probable account of what happened, centers on a specific stretch of the Colorado River near River Mile 232. Historian Otis Marston, who spent decades researching the Grand Canyon's river history with a rigor that few have matched before or since, made a detailed and compelling case that the Hydes were most likely swept out of their scow somewhere in that corridor. The submerged granite formations in that section of the river have a documented history of damaging, snaring, and capsizing boats that goes back well over a century. Marston described the area in terms that make the danger concrete. Pieces of granite wall lie submerged just below the surface, positioned in ways that interact catastrophically with a boat moving at river speed. A single wrong angle, a hull catching a hidden edge at the wrong moment, and two people standing in a flat-bottomed scow with no life jackets would be in the water before they had time to react. The inner gorge of the Colorado River is not a place where people who fall in tend to be found. The current in that section is powerful and relentless. The canyon walls in many stretches offer no bank to stop against. Sheer rock dropping directly into the water, no shore, no ledge, nowhere for a body to catch. Bodies carried into that current can travel extraordinary distances before surfacing. And in many cases, the canyon's geography means they may never surface at all. The river swallows things and keeps them. It always has. This explanation fits most of the evidence. It accounts for the absence of bodies. It accounts for the location where the boat was found, floating downstream from the most dangerous section of the route. It is the version that, if you forced a historian to give you a single answer, they would probably give you. But it does not account for the boat. And the boat is the thing that makes this case impossible to set down cleanly. Here's what doesn't make sense. If the Hydes were thrown into the Colorado River during a capsize in a rapid, particularly in the violent, rock-strewn corridor near River Mile 232, the scow itself should carry evidence of that event. A 20-foot wooden flat bottom hitting submerged granite at river speed in fast current does not emerge undamaged 5 miles downstream. It gets battered. It gets flipped. It loses cargo. The rigging breaks or shifts. When the search party reached the boat at mile 237, what they found was a vessel in perfect condition. Upright, loaded, every supply strapped down exactly as the Hydes had packed it. No structural damage, no indication that anything violent had happened anywhere near it. The boat looked like it had been deliberately parked and abandoned, not like it had survived a capsize that killed its crew. That specific contradiction, the pristine condition of the boat against the backdrop of 2 missing people, is the detail that refuses to resolve, no matter which theory you apply to it. And then the other stories started coming. In 1971, 43 years after the Hydes disappeared, a group was running a commercial river trip down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon when something extraordinary happened. An elderly woman on board the trip stood up and made an announcement to the other passengers. She told them that she was Bessie Hyde, that she had survived whatever had happened on the river in November 1928, that she had killed Glenn Hyde during a fight, that she had stabbed him, and had then hiked out of the Grand Canyon alone, and had been living an entirely different life under a different identity ever since. The other passengers on the trip were stunned. The woman was approximately the age that Bessie would have been. She seemed to know specific details about the trip, about the canyon, about the Hyde story. For a brief, electric, extraordinary moment, it seemed as though the Grand Canyon's most famous cold case was about to be resolved by confession on a riverboat, in the same canyon where it had started 4 decades earlier. And then she took it back. She recanted the entire story, said she had made it up. The claim was investigated regardless. Historians and investigators looked at it seriously, because even a recanted story needed to be checked against what was known. The problems with it became apparent quickly. Glenn Hyde's documented character and behavior did not fit the portrait of an abusive or threatening husband that the woman's account implied. The timeline of the alleged solo escape from the canyon had logistical problems that didn't resolve cleanly. The woman's own identity was never publicly confirmed or released. Researchers ultimately concluded that the account was fabricated, possibly a dark joke taken too far, possibly the product of something more complicated, and set it aside. But the theory it had introduced into the public record did not go away with the recantation. It had found a foothold, and it would resurface in a far stranger form 21 years later. In May 1992, a woman named Georgie Clark died in Las Vegas. If you knew anything about Grand Canyon River history, you knew who Georgie Clark was. She was a legend, the first woman to own a commercial rafting operation on the Colorado River, a pioneer who had spent decades running the canyon professionally and had become one of the most respected figures in the river running world. Tough, independent, larger than life. She had been on the Colorado more times than most people could count. She had outlasted rivals, built a business from nothing, and carved out a reputation that the river community revered. After her death, the friends who went through her belongings found 3 things that stopped them completely: a copy of Glenn and Bessie Hyde's marriage certificate, a pistol, and a birth certificate identifying Georgie Clark's legal first name, not as Georgie, but as Bessie DeRoss, a name she had apparently never used publicly in her entire adult life. The theory ignited within the river running community almost immediately. Georgie Clark was Bessie Hyde. She had survived the 1928 disappearance. She had changed her name, built a new identity, and returned to the very river where her husband had vanished. Spending decades running the Grand Canyon professionally, in plain sight, never telling anyone who she really was. It was an extraordinary idea. It was also the kind of idea that, once you've heard it, is very difficult to stop thinking about. Now, this is where you have to be careful, because the theory is compelling in exactly the way that theories become dangerous. It feels right. It has the shape of a true thing, and the evidence around it is genuinely ambiguous rather than clearly disproven. Here is what is actually established. Georgie Clark's early life is reasonably documented under her birth name, Bessie DeRoss, in records that predate the Hyde honeymoon trip. She was married twice under her own identity. She had a daughter who died in a bicycle accident. The arc of her documented early life, insofar as historians have been able to reconstruct it, does not map cleanly onto a scenario where she was simultaneously Bessie Hyde. The physical logistics of a 22-year-old woman surviving a capsize or whatever event took the Hydes, hiking out of the inner Grand Canyon alone in late November with no supplies, and then constructing an entirely new identity that held for 60-plus years. Those logistics have real problems. No DNA testing comparing Clark's remains to the Hyde family has ever been conducted, which means the question has never been definitively answered in either direction. The marriage certificate and the pistol, found in her home, have never been explained. Why Georgie Clark had those specific items in her possession at the time of her death is not known. She apparently never told anyone. And so the theory persists, not as something proven and not as something disproven, but as something permanently suspended in the ambiguity that this case seems to generate at every turn. In 1976, skeletal remains were discovered on the property of Emery Kolb, the photographer who had hosted the Hydes on their final day at the Rim, one of the last confirmed people to see them alive. The skull had a bullet inside it. The remains were found on Kolb's own land. The implication was immediate, and investigators took it seriously. Were these Glenn Hyde's remains? And did Emery Kolb know more about the 1928 disappearance than he had ever acknowledged? The investigation went nowhere productive. Forensic analysis established that the skeleton belonged to a male who had died no earlier than 1972, more than 4 decades after the Hydes disappeared. He was far too young to be Glenn Hyde, who would have been in his 70s by that point. Eventually, through further investigation, the remains were identified as those of an unrelated suicide victim, a separate cold case with no connection to the Hydes. Kolb was cleared of any meaningful connection to the 1928 disappearance. So the evidence, assembled in full, looks like this. A calm final journal entry, written near Diamond Creek in late November 1928, with no indication of crisis. A boat floating perfectly intact and fully loaded 45 miles from the end of the canyon. No bodies, no remains, no physical trace of either person in 96 years of searching. A woman who claimed to be Bessie Hyde on a river trip in 1971, and then took it back. A celebrated river guide who died with an unexplained marriage certificate and a birth name she never used. A skeleton on a photographer's property that turned out to belong to someone else entirely. Not one of these threads resolves. Not one of them closes. The case exists in a state of permanent incompletion that the Grand Canyon seems almost designed to maintain. A landscape so vast, so vertical, so indifferent to the humans who move through it, that it can hold a secret for a century without effort. The scow drifting alone in the inner gorge, upright, fully loaded, every supply strapped down, silent. As if Glenn and Bessie had only stepped away for a moment and fully intended to come back and finish what they had started. They were 45 miles from history. They have been missing for 96 years. The river has never given back a single piece of them. The Hydes vanished on a river they had nearly conquered, in a canyon that keeps everything it takes. Morgan Heimer knew that canyon better than almost any tourist or weekend hiker ever could. He was a professional guide. He was surrounded by the clients he was leading. He was standing on the riverbank in broad daylight at a spot he had been to before. And the canyon still took him just as cleanly, just as completely, and just as silently as it took Glenn and Bessie Hyde 87 years before him. June 2nd, 2015. The Colorado River, inside the Grand Canyon. Day 6 of an 8-day guided river trip operated by Tour West, one of the established commercial outfitters running the canyon at that time. The group had been on the water for nearly a week. They had navigated dozens of rapids. They had camped on the canyon floor, eaten together, built the particular kind of easy familiarity that develops between strangers who have shared something physically demanding for several days running. The hard part of the trip was largely behind them. 2 more days, and they would be out. The guide leading the trip was named Morgan Heimer. He was 22 years old. 22 years old, and already doing this professionally. Already trusted with the safety and experience of a full group of paying clients on one of the most technically demanding river routes in the country. That tells you something about who Morgan was. He was not a beginner who had stumbled into a job that was beyond him. He was an avid outdoorsman who had pursued this kind of work deliberately, who had trained for it, who had the physical capability and the river knowledge to be given this responsibility at an age when most people are still figuring out what they want to do with their lives. His employers trusted him. His clients trusted him. The river, by all accounts, was a place Morgan Heimer understood. The group stopped at Pumpkin Springs. It is a known landmark on the Colorado River inside the Grand Canyon. A large travertine dome formation created over thousands of years by calcium carbonate deposits from a nearby spring, positioned right at the river's edge. The pool it creates is visually striking, the kind of geological feature that stops people mid-trip and makes them reach for their cameras. It also happens to be toxic. The water in the Pumpkin Springs pool contains elevated levels of arsenic and other heavy metals, enough that the National Park Service has posted warnings about it for years, cautioning visitors not to drink from it or swim in it. It is a beautiful thing that you are not supposed to touch. The group had stopped to rest and swim in the river itself, not in the pool, at this landmark location. It was a natural break point on day 6, a chance to cool off and decompress before the final push to the end of the trip. The river here, in this section of the lower canyon, does not have the extreme violent current of the Upper Gorge Rapids. It moves, but it is not the kind of water that grabs you without warning and takes you somewhere you didn't choose to go. It is the kind of river section where experienced swimmers are comfortable, where a guide with Morgan's background would have had no reason for unusual concern. Morgan was at the river's edge. He had been speaking with some of the clients, a normal mid-break conversation, nothing urgent, nothing that anyone later described as tense or strange. He was standing at the bank. People were in and around the water. The afternoon light was doing what it does inside the Grand Canyon, turning the walls that particular deep gold that makes the place look like something from another world. Someone looked away. When they looked back, Morgan Heimer was not there. Here's the critical detail, and it is the one that makes this case so deeply strange. There was no splash, no shout, no struggle, no indication from any witness present that anything had happened, no sound of someone entering the water, no cry for help, no visible disturbance in the river surface. He was there, and then he was not there. And nobody who was present saw the moment of transition between those two states. It was assumed at first that he had simply walked away, stepped behind a rock, gone to check something upstream, taken a few minutes to himself. Guides on long trips sometimes do. Nobody panicked immediately, and then he didn't come back. Minutes stretched. Someone called his name. No answer. The group began moving along the bank, checking the immediate area, looking around the travertine dome, scanning the river upstream and downstream. Nothing. Morgan Heimer had been at the river's edge at Pumpkin Springs, surrounded by his clients, in the middle of a normal afternoon break on a trip he was leading. And he had ceased to exist between one glance and the next. Now this is where the case turns dark. The National Park Service launched a search that began within hours of the group raising the alarm. The search ran for 6 days. 6 full days of coordinated effort involving both river teams working the water and land teams working the canyon walls and banks above and below the site. The NPS has significant resources for exactly this kind of emergency. They know the canyon. They know the river. They know where a body carried by the current in that section tends to go, where it tends to catch, where the eddies and the side channels create the pockets where things stop moving. They searched all of it. They found nothing. Not Morgan's body, not a piece of his clothing, not a personal item, not a single physical trace of his presence anywhere along the river corridor from Pumpkin Springs downstream through the search zone. 6 days of professional search and rescue in a landscape that the searchers knew intimately, and nothing. But here's what doesn't make sense. And this is the contradiction that defines the Morgan Heimer case and separates it from a straightforward river accident. He was an excellent swimmer. That detail is not a minor footnote. It is the central problem with every explanation that involves him simply falling into the water. A 22-year-old avid outdoorsman, described by everyone who knew him as physically capable and experienced in exactly this environment, does not silently enter a moderate river current and vanish without producing any observable event. Drowning, even sudden drowning, involves a physical process that takes time and produces evidence, movement, sound, disturbance in the water. Witnesses were present. Nobody saw anything. There is also the question of Pumpkin Springs itself. The toxic travertine pool sits directly adjacent to the river at this location. The NPS warnings about the pool are clear and well known to anyone working the canyon professionally. Morgan would have been aware of them. Whether the pool played any role in what happened to him is officially unknown and unconfirmed. It is speculation to suggest he entered it. But it sits there in the geography of the case, a toxic body of water within feet of where he was last standing. And the speculation is not unreasonable, even if the evidence does not support it. What the evidence does support is only this. Morgan Heimer was a trained and experienced river guide, standing on a riverbank in the company of his clients at a known and familiar landmark. On day 6 of a trip he was professionally equipped to complete. Someone looked away. When they looked back, he was gone. And 6 days of organized searching by people who knew exactly where to look found absolutely nothing. A trained guide, surrounded by clients at a spot he knew. There, then not. No splash, no sound. The Colorado River moving past Pumpkin Springs is the same way it always has, carrying whatever it carries, keeping what it keeps. The Grand Canyon had now taken people across nearly 9 decades, from Glenn and Bessie Hyde in 1928 to Morgan Heimer in 2015, with the same essential outcome each time. People go in. The canyon closes around them, and the searches come back empty. But at least in those cases, there were witnesses. There were people who knew the missing person had been there. There was a starting point for a search, a last known location, a timeline to work from. The next person who disappeared in the Grand Canyon left behind nothing but a car. No trip plan filed, no hiking permit, no one who knew he was there that day, no one who knew to look. Just a vehicle in a parking lot at a trailhead, sitting there long enough that someone eventually noticed it wasn't moving. And by then, whatever had happened was already finished. Jong Yan Juan walked into the Grand Canyon in 2017. And the only reason anyone knows he was there at all is because his car was still in the lot when everyone else had driven home. 2017, Grand Canyon National Park, Arizona. At some point during that year, the exact date is not established in public record, a vehicle was found abandoned at a trailhead parking area inside the park. It had been there long enough that someone flagged it. Long enough that it stood out from the ordinary rotation of cars that arrive in the morning and leave in the evening. The 6 million annual visitors cycling through the lot in the reliable rhythm of a tourist destination. This car had stopped cycling. It was just sitting there. The car belonged to a man named Jong Yan Juan. And that car, parked at the edge of the Grand Canyon, engine cold, owner nowhere, is the entirety of the confirmed physical evidence in this case. It is not a starting point that leads somewhere. It is the whole story, at least as far as public record goes. Here's the critical detail, and it reframes everything about how this disappearance is categorized and investigated. No one knew Jong Yan Juan was planning to visit the Grand Canyon that day. He had not filed a trip itinerary with the National Park Service. He had not obtained a backcountry permit, which would have created a paper record of his intended route and a timeline for when rangers should expect him to return. There was no friend, no family member, no colleague who knew where he had gone and could raise an alarm when he didn't come back. The first indication that something had happened was the car itself. Not a missing persons report, not a worried phone call, just a vehicle that had been in the same parking spot for too long. The Grand Canyon receives approximately 6 million visitors every year. The South Rim in particular moves enormous volumes of people through its parking areas and trailheads on a daily basis. A car that stays past closing, a car that is still there the next morning. That is the kind of anomaly that rangers are trained to notice. Someone noticed. By the time they did, whatever had happened to Jong Yan Juan was already over. Now this is where the case turns dark, because the horror of this particular disappearance is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is the horror of invisibility, of a person who moved through a place that 6 million other people also moved through, and left no trace of his passing except a vehicle in a lot, and was not missed by anyone until a stranger noticed his car. The Grand Canyon backcountry is a specific and particular kind of dangerous. The trails that descend from the rim to the canyon floor drop more than 5,000 feet in elevation over distances that feel manageable on paper and are catastrophic in practice, particularly for unprepared hikers in summer. The temperature differential between the rim and the canyon bottom can exceed 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Cooler air at the top, lethal heat accumulating in the inner gorge below. In summer months, temperatures at the canyon floor regularly exceed 115 degrees. The NPS posts warnings about this constantly, on signs at every major trailhead, in literature handed to visitors at the entrance gates, on their website. Hundreds of people are rescued from the canyons every year after underestimating what the descent and the heat will do to them. Dozens have died. And those are the people who came prepared, who told someone where they were going, who had a timeline that someone was tracking. Jong Yan Juan had none of that. There was no timeline. There was no one tracking him. There was just a car. The NPS listed one's case in their cold case database, which is the mechanism the Park Service uses to document unresolved disappearances and deaths within the park boundaries. The details available in public reporting are sparse. His name, the year, the abandoned vehicle, the cold case status. The scope of the search that was conducted after his vehicle was flagged, the trails that were checked, the timeline of the investigation. Those details are not fully documented in sources available to the public. What is clear is that he was never found. No remains, no gear, no trail markers of his passage into the canyon have been publicly reported as recovered. The invisibility of his situation is the thing that stays with you. 6 million people visit the Grand Canyon every year, and the infrastructure of that volume of tourism creates a kind of paradox. The place is simultaneously one of the most visited natural landmarks on Earth, and one of the most effective at making individuals disappear. The canyon is large enough, 277 miles long, up to 18 miles wide, more than a mile deep. That a single person moving through its backcountry without a permit or a plan is essentially untrackable. The rim is covered in people. 50 feet below the rim, you are alone. But here's what doesn't make sense about the one case in the broader context of Grand Canyon disappearances. The abandoned vehicle protocol is specifically designed to catch exactly this situation. When a car is flagged at a Grand Canyon trailhead, rangers are supposed to cross-reference it against backcountry permits, check the registration, attempt to contact the owner, and initiate a welfare check. The system exists because the canyon's history is full of cases where the car was the only warning sign. The fact that Juan's case became a cold case rather than a rescue suggests that by the time the vehicle was flagged and the response protocol was initiated, the window for a successful outcome had already closed. How long the car sat before it was noticed is not confirmed in public record. What that unknown span of time represents, hours, a day, longer, is the gap that the case lives inside. It is the space between a man walking away from a parking lot toward a canyon rim and the moment a stranger noticed his car was still there. Everything that happened to Jong Yan Juan happened in that gap, in a place where no one was watching and no one was looking, and the canyon kept all of it. Just a car, in a parking lot, at the edge of the world. No permit, no plan, no one who knew to look. The canyon does not distinguish between the people who come prepared and the people who don't. It takes both, and it keeps what it takes. And it does not explain itself to anyone. Randy Doyle Parcell Jr. was not alone when he disappeared. He was 10 years old, and he was hiking with his family. And the people who loved him most were within shouting distance when the canyon swallowed him anyway. That case is 46 years old now, and it has never produced a single confirmed answer. And the terrain that took a child from a family hike in 1979 has never given him back. April 1979, Pepper Sauce Canyon near Oracle, Arizona. The canyon sits in the terrain north of Tucson, near the Pinal and Pima County line. Remote, rugged, the kind of place that is beautiful in the specific way of southern Arizona high desert. With rocky outcroppings and dense scrub brush and passages that narrow and twist in ways that make it easy for a group to spread out without anyone immediately realizing how far the spread has gone. In 1979, the trail infrastructure in that area was limited compared to today. There were no GPS devices, no personal locator beacons, no cell phones. If something went wrong in Pepper Sauce Canyon in April 1979, the only tools available were human eyes and voices and whatever physical stamina the searchers could bring to the terrain. Randy was 10 years old. He was hiking with his family, not a reckless solo venture, not a child left to wander, but a family outing in a local canyon, the kind of activity that Arizona families did on spring weekends and do still. He became separated from the group. That is the entirety of the public account of how it began. A child hiking with family, a separation, and then nothing. The exact moment of separation, the precise location within the canyon where the family last had eyes on Randy, the timeline of how long passed before the alarm was raised. Those details are not documented in sources available to the public record. What is documented is the outcome. The search found nothing. Randy Doyle Parcell Jr. was never located. No remains, no clothing, no evidence of what happened after he separated from his family in Pepper Sauce Canyon in April 1979. The case was eventually documented in cold case databases, including the Doyle Network, which catalogs unresolved missing persons cases. But no significant investigative developments have been reported in the decades since. Here's what drives the particular dread of this case. The family was present. This is not a story about a child left unsupervised, or a situation that could have been prevented by better decision-making about where to go or who to bring. A child was hiking with the people whose entire purpose was to keep him safe, in a canyon that looked ordinary enough for a spring weekend, and the terrain took him anyway. In a split second of separation, the kind that happens on family hikes all the time, a child falling a few steps behind, the group moving around a rock formation. Something happened that 46 years of silence has never explained. A family walked into a canyon together in April. Only some of them walked out. Randy was 10 years old. He never got older. He has been in that canyon, or whatever happened to him in that canyon, for 46 years, and the desert has not said a word about it. Randy vanished from a canyon with his family around him. Mindy Chambers was 17 years old, and she disappeared from a suburban street in Mesa, 2 blocks from home, on a school morning. The canyon that swallowed her had sidewalks and traffic lights, and neighbors who were awake and going about their days. And she still vanished, as completely as any hiker who ever walked off a trail into the Arizona wilderness and never found their way back. October 19th, 1982. Mesa, Arizona. East Valley suburb, the kind of neighborhood that is entirely ordinary in the way that middle-class American suburbs are ordinary. Residential streets laid out in grids, school routes that kids walk every morning, front lawns that look the same as the one next door. The ambient safety of a place where nothing dramatic is supposed to happen. It was a Monday morning. The school day was starting. People were going about their routines. Mindy Chambers was 17 years old. She was walking her stepsister to school. That is the last confirmed thing anyone saw her do. She walked out of the house on a school morning with her stepsister beside her, heading toward the school a short distance away, on streets she knew, in a neighborhood she lived in. She was 17 years old, and she was doing one of the most ordinary things a person can do on a Monday morning. And she never came back. But here's what you need to understand about the days immediately before October 19th, 1982. Because the context is everything in this case, and without it, the disappearance looks like one kind of story when it is actually something else entirely. In the days before she vanished, Mindy Chambers had gone to the police. She had reported that her father had sexually molested her. That is a documented fact in the public record of this case. Reported by the Doyle Network and referenced in multiple cold case databases that have cataloged her disappearance. She had told authorities what was happening to her. In response, she had been removed from her father's care and placed in the custody of her stepmother. A 17-year-old girl had done one of the hardest and most dangerous things a person in her situation can do. She had told someone in authority. She had named the person responsible. She had taken the step that the adults in her life and the systems around her were supposed to respond to. And they had responded, technically. She had been moved to a different home. 3 days later, she was gone. She left behind her purse. She left behind her identification. She left behind all of her personal belongings, everything that a person would take if they were choosing to leave, everything that a person needs to function in the world beyond the immediate neighborhood. She walked her stepsister to school, and then she did not walk back. And she left everything that would have told the world who she was, sitting in the house behind her. Now this is where the case turns dark. And the darkness is not only in the disappearance itself. It is in what happened, or rather, what did not happen, in the years that followed. Mindy Chambers was not reported missing to the police until April 1995. 13 years after she walked out of that house on a Monday morning and never came back. 13 years during which her family, by at least some accounts, believed or told themselves or told others that she had run away, that she had chosen to leave, that the 17-year-old girl who had just reported abuse to police and had been placed in a new home had simply decided to go somewhere else and had not been in touch. Let that sit for a moment, because the 13-year reporting gap is not a footnote in this case. It is one of the central facts of it, and it does something specific and irreversible to the possibility of ever answering the question of what happened to Mindy Chambers. In a missing persons case, time is the enemy of evidence in a way that is difficult to overstate. Physical evidence degrades. Witnesses' memories change. Surveillance footage, to whatever extent that existed in 1982, is long gone. People who might have seen something on the morning of October 19th on those Mesa streets have moved, aged, died, forgotten. The specific details that a thorough investigation conducted in October 1982 might have surfaced. A car someone noticed, a person in the area who didn't belong, a conversation Mindy had in the days before she vanished, are gone. Permanently, irretrievably gone. Because nobody opened a case file until 1995. Here's what doesn't make sense, and it is the contradiction that sits at the center of this case, like a splinter that cannot be removed. Mindy left her purse behind. She left her ID behind. She left everything behind. And the explanation that the family appears to have operated under for 13 years was that she ran away. But a 17-year-old girl who is choosing to run away, who has made a decision to leave her life and start somewhere else, takes her purse. She takes her identification. Those are not things you accidentally forget when you are deliberately departing. Those are the things you cannot function without. The absence of those items from her personal effects is not consistent with a voluntary departure. It is consistent with a departure that was not voluntary at all. The Doe Network documentation of Mindy's case notes this directly. The purse, the ID, the personal belongings, all left behind. The reporting delay of 13 years. The timing of the disappearance, 3 days after she had reported abuse to police. These are the facts of the case as publicly documented, and they do not arrange themselves into a picture that supports the runaway explanation. But here's the further problem. Because the case wasn't reported until 1995, there are no publicly named persons of interest. There is no documented investigation from 1982. There are no witness statements on record from the days immediately following her disappearance. No canvassing of the neighborhood from that October morning. No forensic work from the scene. Whatever happened on those Mesa streets on October 19th, 1982, was never investigated at the time it happened. The trail that existed in October 1982, the trail that might have led somewhere, was cold before anyone official even knew to follow it. What the public record does contain is this: a 17-year-old girl, 3 days after reporting sexual abuse to police, walked 2 blocks toward a school and did not return. She left her purse and her ID behind. She was not reported missing for 13 years. When the report was finally filed, Mesa police began working with the information they had, which was almost none. The case was added to cold case databases. It has remained there, unresolved, for decades. There are things about Mindy Chambers' disappearance that the public record simply does not contain. The full account of what her family knew or believed in those 13 years. Whether anyone made inquiries that fell short of a formal missing persons report. Whether anyone in the neighborhood saw anything on that Monday morning that was never officially recorded because there was no case to record it in. The stepsister's account of that morning, of walking to school with Mindy, of whatever the last moments of that walk looked like, has not been disclosed in any public reporting that exists in accessible sources. The theory space in this case is deliberately kept narrow because the evidence does not support expansive speculation. What can be said is this: the circumstances of Mindy's disappearance, the timing relative to the abuse report, the personal belongings left behind, the 13-year silence, are not consistent with a straightforward runaway scenario. What they are consistent with is something more serious. But naming a specific person or a specific cause without evidence is not something the public record supports, and it is not something responsible documentation of this case does. What remains is the shape of it. A girl who did a brave and dangerous thing by telling the police what was happening to her. A system that moved her to a different address and considered the immediate problem addressed. 3 days later, gone. Everything she owned, left behind. 13 years of silence. From the people who should have been the first to raise the alarm. She told police what was happening to her. They moved her to a different address. 3 days after that, she walked her stepsister to school on a Monday morning in Mesa, Arizona, and the street absorbed her completely. It was 1982. Nobody opened a case file until 1995. By then, the trail was 13 years cold, and whatever those Mesa streets knew about what happened to Mindy Chambers, they had long since stopped telling. She was 17 years old. She had just done the hardest thing she had ever done. And then she was gone. And for more than a decade, nobody in any official capacity was even looking. The East Valley suburb where Mindy Chambers disappeared looks the same as it did in 1982. Residential streets, school routes, ordinary front lawns, the ambient safety of a neighborhood where nothing dramatic is supposed to happen. Whatever happened there on October 19th happened quietly, in plain sight, and has never been answered. Mindy vanished from a suburb that should have been the safest place in the world. On the most ordinary of mornings, and the people who should have looked didn't look for 13 years. The 3 men in the next case were reported missing almost immediately. The search began within days, and the Superstition Mountains still didn't give them back easily. Because the Superstition Mountains never give anything back easily. And 3 men chasing the same legend that had already claimed Jesse Capen were about to find out exactly what that meant in the coldest months of the year. Late 2010. Apache Junction, Arizona. 3 men from Utah drove into the Superstition Mountains and did not drive back out. Their names were Curtis Merworth, Ardean Charles, and Malcolm Meeks. The exact date they entered the wilderness is not confirmed in the public record. What is documented is that they went in during the late season when the superstitions are no longer the sun-scorched desert terrain that kills unprepared summer hikers through dehydration and heat exposure, but something different, and in some ways more treacherous, a high-elevation winter wilderness where temperatures drop sharply after dark, where the volcanic rock holds cold the way it holds heat in August, and where hypothermia becomes the threat that replaces heat stroke without any reduction in the terrain's fundamental indifference to the people moving through it. They were looking for the lost Dutchman's mine. If that sounds familiar, it should. Jesse Capen had walked into these exact mountains just 1 year earlier, driven by the same obsession, carrying a secret he had hidden from his family for years. He had left behind his water and his food and his wallet. He had climbed to the summit of Tortilla Mountain in a post-storm darkness and left a note in a jar to prove he had been there. His remains would not be found for 3 more years. The Superstition Mountains had taken him quietly and completely, and the search teams were still going out every weekend looking for him when Curtis Merworth, R.D. and Charles, and Malcolm Meeks made the decision to go in. The Lost Dutchman's Mine is one of the most persistent legends in American folklore. A German immigrant named Jacob Waltz, the Dutchman of the name, allegedly discovered a rich gold deposit somewhere in the Superstition Mountains in the 1800s and died without clearly disclosing its location, leaving behind only fragments of directions and the suggestion of enormous wealth waiting to be claimed. Whether the mine exists at all in the form the legend describes has never been established. What is established is the body count of people who have gone looking for it. Estimates of how many people have died in the Superstitions while searching for the lost Dutchman range into the hundreds across more than a century. The mountain range has a documented, specific, historical relationship with the legend and with the people the legend pulls in. That is unlike almost any other location in the American Southwest. Curtis Merworth, R.D. and Charles, and Malcolm Meeks were 3 adults, traveling together, going into a place with that history in the late season, without the preparation, the terrain, and conditions required. The specific details of what they brought with them, what route they planned to take, what their level of backcountry experience was. Those details are not fully documented in the public record. What is documented is the outcome, and the outcome speaks to the conditions they encountered and the state they were in when those conditions found them. They failed to return. A search was launched after they were reported missing. And in January 2011, search teams recovered the remains of R.D. and Charles and Malcolm Meeks in the Superstition Wilderness. The remains of a person believed to be Curtis Merworth were found approximately the same time. The official cause of death for all 3 men was determined to be hypothermia. Now this is where you have to sit with what that means. Because hypothermia as a cause of death in the Superstition Mountains carries a specific and terrible logic that is worth understanding before moving past it. Hypothermia does not announce itself the way dehydration does. Dehydration builds over hours, thirst intensifies, the body sends escalating signals. There is time to recognize what is happening and respond to it if you have any resources available. Hypothermia is more insidious. In the early stages, the body shivers and the mind remains relatively clear. But as core body temperature drops, cognitive function begins to deteriorate in ways that the affected person cannot accurately assess. Judgment becomes impaired. Decision-making degrades. The ability to recognize that you are in serious danger and to take the steps that might address that danger diminishes precisely as the danger becomes most acute. People experiencing hypothermia have been documented making decisions that are objectively counterproductive to their survival, without any subjective awareness that their thinking has been compromised. In the Superstition Mountains in late 2010, 3 men moving through high-elevation volcanic terrain after dark, without adequate gear for the temperatures they encountered, would have faced exactly this progression. The cold comes fast in those mountains once the sun drops. The terrain offers no shelter that isn't already occupied by the wildlife that lives in it. If they became disoriented, if the route back to the trailhead stopped making sense to them, if the landmarks they had used to navigate during daylight hours became ambiguous in the dark, the hypothermia that was already underway would have been making it progressively harder to reason through the problem they were in. Here's the critical detail. There were 3 of them. 3 people traveling together means 3 sets of eyes. 3 people to check each other's thinking. 3 chances to catch the early warning signs that one person alone might miss. The conventional wisdom of wilderness safety is built on exactly this logic: that a group is safer than an individual because the group can intervene when one member's judgment starts to fail. 3 people should have been 3 chances to turn around when conditions deteriorated. 3 people should have been 3 voices saying, "This is getting bad. We need to go back. This is not worth continuing." All 3 of them died in the same mountains on the same trip. What that means, practically in terms of the sequence of events, is that whatever process took hold of Curtis Merworth, Ardian Charles, and Malcolm Meeks in the Superstition Mountains in late 2010 took hold of all 3 of them at roughly the same pace and in the same direction. The cold, the terrain, the disorientation, the deteriorating judgment. It moved through the group faster than the group could respond to it collectively. By the time any one of them was in a condition to recognize the full danger they were in, the others were in the same condition. There was no one with clear enough judgment to lead them out. This is the thing about the Superstition Mountains, that the statistics around them, the deaths, the disappearances, the search and rescue operations, communicate in aggregate, but that individual cases make visceral. The wilderness does not care about your preparation relative to the season you are in. It cares about the specific conditions on the specific night you are in it. Jesse Capen was research-obsessed and methodical, and had been to these mountains before. He died in a crevasse half a mile from his camp. 3 men traveling together, with the safety advantage of numbers, died of hypothermia in the same range 1 year later. The superstitions do not grade on a curve for effort or company. But here's what doesn't make sense, or rather, what makes a different kind of sense than the official record conveys. The bodies of Charles and Meeks were not found until January 2011, which means there was a period of weeks between when the 3 men were reported missing and when the search teams located the remains. The Superstition Wilderness in winter is a different search environment than the summer version. Vegetation changes, terrain features that are navigable in dry conditions become problematic after precipitation. The search windows are compressed by shorter daylight hours and colder conditions for the searchers themselves. The fact that it took weeks to locate 3 people who entered the wilderness together and died in the same general area speaks to the specific difficulty of finding anyone in 160,200 acres of volcanic backcountry, regardless of the season. The Lost Dutchman's mine itself remains officially unfound. Whatever Jacob Waltz discovered in the Superstition Mountains in the 1800s, if he discovered anything, has not been located, claimed, or verified in the century and more of searching that has followed his death. The mine's continued elusiveness is not the tragedy. The people who have gone looking for it are the tragedy. Jesse Capen, whose remains were found in a crevasse in 2012. Curtis Merworth, Ardian Charles, and Malcolm Meeks, found in January 2011. and those are only the cases documented in detail. The long history of the Superstitions includes dozens of other names, other searchers, other people who believed they had found the clue that everyone before them had missed. The Superstition Mountains have been taking people for a very long time. They do not distinguish between the obsessives and the unprepared, between the ones who came alone and the ones who came in groups, between the people who told their families where they were going and the people who kept it secret. The mountains take all of them with the same indifference, and the search teams recover what they can. And the legend continues pulling the next wave of believers toward the same terrain. 3 men from Utah walked into the same mountains that had swallowed Jesse Capen 1 year earlier. They were found in January, when the desert had already done what it does in the cold months. The official record closed on them with a cause of death. But the Superstitions themselves closed on nothing. They are still out there, 60 miles east of Phoenix, still running 4,500 to 5,000 feet of elevation above the valley floor, still covering 160,200 acres of terrain that has absorbed more searchers than it has ever returned answers to. Floyd Roberts was not looking for gold. He was an experienced hiker who knew the terrain he was in, who had a plan, who was part of a group, who told his companions exactly where he was going and when he intended to rejoin them. He had every advantage that Curtis Merworth, Ardean Charles, and Malcolm Meeks did not have. He had experience, familiarity, a support structure, and a timeline. He walked away from his group in the Grand Canyon backcountry in 2016 into terrain he knew, toward a meeting point he had specified. And he never arrived. And the canyon that he knew kept him just as completely and just as silently as it keeps everything else. 2016, Grand Canyon National Park, Arizona. A hiking group moving through the backcountry reaches a point in the trail where the plan calls for a split. It is a deliberate separation. Not an accident, not a moment of distraction, not a child falling behind while the adults move around a rock formation. This is a decision made in advance, discussed and agreed upon, executed intentionally. The group will divide here. One person will take a different route through terrain he knows, and they will meet up again at a specified point further along. It is the kind of logistical arrangement that experienced backcountry hikers make regularly, splitting to cover different ground, rejoining at a landmark, using the group's collective knowledge of the area to see more of it efficiently. The man who walked away from the group was named Floyd E. Roberts. He was an adult hiker, and he knew the area around where he left them. That detail, his familiarity with the terrain, is one of the few personal facts about Floyd Roberts that appears in the public documentation of his case. He was not a tourist who had wandered off a maintained trail into backcountry he didn't understand. He was someone who had been in this part of the Grand Canyon before, who understood the landscape he was moving through, who had a specific destination in mind and a specific time to be there. He never arrived. His group waited at the rendezvous point. The time came and went. They waited longer, giving the natural buffer that experienced hikers allow for the unpredictability of backcountry travel. A twisted ankle, a longer route than anticipated, a scramble that took more time than it looked like it would from a distance. More time passed. Floyd Roberts did not appear. The group raised the alarm, and the National Park Service initiated a search. Now this is where the case turns dark. because the timing of Floyd Roberts' disappearance introduced a factor that compressed the survival window in a way that transformed a concerning situation into something almost certainly fatal within hours. In the days immediately following Floyd Roberts' disappearance, the temperature in the Grand Canyon backcountry spiked dramatically. Nearly 20 degrees above what would be considered normal for the conditions, pushing past 115 degrees Fahrenheit in the inner canyon. The NPS has documented the specific danger of rapid temperature increases in the backcountry repeatedly and in detail. A hiker who sets out in manageable conditions and encounters a 20-degree temperature spike partway through their route faces a physiological situation that their body's preparation, the water they carried, the pace they planned, the rest stops they scheduled, was not calibrated for. The heat load increases faster than the body can adapt. Dehydration accelerates. Heat exhaustion can move to heat stroke in a timeline measured in hours rather than days. Floyd Roberts knew this terrain. But he could not have known, when he walked away from his group at the planned separation point, that the temperature was about to spike 20 degrees above normal before he reached the rendezvous. Here's the critical detail that defines this case and distinguishes it from every other Grand Canyon disappearance in this episode. Floyd Roberts had every advantage. He had experience in the specific terrain he was moving through. He had a group who knew where he had gone and what time to expect him. He had a plan, a real plan, with a destination and a timeline and people who would notice immediately when he didn't show up. The systems that are supposed to keep experienced backcountry hikers safe were all in place. The trip plan existed. The support structure existed. The familiarity with the terrain existed. None of it was enough. The NPS search that followed his failure to arrive at the rendezvous point was conducted with the full weight of what the Park Service can bring to a backcountry emergency in the Grand Canyon. Rangers who know the canyon at the level of individual trail features. Search teams with ground and air resources. Knowledge of the specific area where Roberts had been moving, derived from what his group could tell them about the planned route and the separation point. They were not searching blind. They had a last known location, a direction of travel, a target zone that was meaningfully constrained compared to a case like Jong Yan Juan's, where the only starting point was a car in a lot. They found nothing, no remains, no gear, no physical trace of Floyd Roberts anywhere in the search zone. But here's what doesn't make sense, and this is the contradiction that the Grand Canyon produces over and over across the cases in this episode. The canyon is large, but the area where Floyd Roberts was moving was known. His group could describe the separation point. They could describe the intended route. They could give the NPS a corridor to work with rather than a 277-mile park boundary. And still, in terrain that his companions could partially map from memory, in a section of the backcountry that Roberts himself was familiar with, the search came back empty. The Grand Canyon backcountry does not look, from the rim, like a place where things can disappear without trace in a defined search area. It looks like a landscape you can see. Open, exposed, the geology laid out in horizontal bands of color that seem to offer everything up to observation. But that impression is the canyon's most fundamental deception. The inner gorge and the side canyons that branch off the main corridor are full of features that are invisible from above. Drop-offs that cannot be seen from the trail above them. Slots and crevasses in the canyon walls that are too narrow to be visible from search aircraft. Sections of the Tonto platform and the esplanade where the terrain folds in ways that create effectively unreachable pockets. The Grand Canyon has been hiding things in those folds for a very long time. the temperature spike that followed Floyd Roberts' disappearance, the 20-degree anomaly that pushed conditions past 115 degrees, creates the most plausible framework for what happened to him in the hours after he walked away from his group. A man moving through familiar terrain in conditions that were manageable when he left, encountering a heat event that his preparation did not account for. Heat exhaustion moving toward heat stroke, the body's thermoregulation failing under a load it was not built for. Cognitive function degrading as core temperature rises. The same insidious process that hypothermia runs in reverse, where the ability to make sound decisions about your own situation deteriorates precisely as the consequences of poor decisions become most severe. If Floyd Roberts was incapacitated by heat in the Grand Canyon backcountry, if he went down in one of those invisible folds in the terrain, in a slot canyon or a crevasse or a section of the Tonto platform that is not visible from above, the search teams operating under 115-degree conditions were themselves working at the outer edge of what is physiologically sustainable. The same heat that may have killed Floyd Roberts was limiting the ability of the people looking for him to stay in the field long enough to search exhaustively. His case was added to the National Park Service's cold case records. As of the available public documentation, no remains and no physical evidence have been recovered. Floyd Roberts walked into a section of the Grand Canyon backcountry that he knew, in the company of a group who knew where he was going, with a plan and a timeline and every reasonable precaution in place. The temperature spiked 20 degrees. He did not arrive at the meeting point. The canyon kept him. What makes the Floyd Roberts case sit differently from the other Grand Canyon disappearances in this episode is precisely the presence of all those safeguards and the complete irrelevance of them to the outcome. Glenn and Bessie Hyde had no life jackets, no modern navigation, no reliable support structure beyond a search launched after they were overdue. Morgan Heimer was young and surrounded by clients, but was taken without a witness observing the moment. Jong Yan Juan had no plan, and no one who knew he was there. Floyd Roberts had experience, familiarity, companions, a plan, and a rendezvous point. He had done everything right. The canyon did not care. He told his group where he was going and when he would be back. They waited. He knew this canyon. The temperature spiked 20 degrees above normal in the hours after he walked away. He didn't come back. The search found nothing. And the Grand Canyon, which has been accumulating unanswered questions since long before Floyd Roberts walked into its backcountry in 2016, added one more to the total and moved on. If the wilderness cases in this episode share a logic, the Superstition Mountains and the Grand Canyon taking people through heat, cold, terrain, distance, and the particular physics of a landscape that is always larger than the person inside it, then the final case is the one that breaks that logic entirely. Because Sherry Doerty did not disappear into a wilderness. She did not walk off a trail or step away from a scenic overlook or push into backcountry without a plan. She disappeared from Paradise Valley, Arizona, one of the wealthiest, most surveilled, most resource-rich neighborhoods in the entire state. A place where the streets are clean and the houses are large, and the ambient infrastructure of safety and visibility is as high as it gets anywhere in Arizona. August 29th, 1991, Paradise Valley. And she vanished just as completely, just as finally, and just as without explanation as everyone else in this episode. The canyon walls of the Grand Canyon did not take Sherry Doerty. Something else did. And 33 years later, it has not been named. August 29th, 1991, Paradise Valley, Arizona. The name itself is doing a specific kind of work. It sounds like a place where nothing bad happens, and that is more or less the point of it. Paradise Valley is a small, incorporated municipality completely surrounded by the Phoenix metro area, bordered by Scottsdale to the east and north, sitting in the valley between Camelback Mountain and the McDowell Mountains. It is one of the wealthiest zip codes in Arizona and has been for decades. The houses there are large. The lots are generous. The streets are quiet in the particular way of places where money has bought distance from the noise and density of the city that surrounds them. In 1991, Paradise Valley was exactly what it looked like. A place where people of means had chosen to live, in a neighborhood that reflected the choices available to them. Sherry Doerty was 28 years old. She disappeared from there on August 29, 1991, and she has not been found in the 33 years since. The public record on Sherry Doerty is sparse in a way that itself becomes part of the story. Her name appears in missing persons databases. She is listed in records that document long-term unresolved cases from Arizona. Her disappearance dated to August 1991. Her last known location given variously as Paradise Valley, and in some database entries, the Apache Junction area. She was 28 years old at the time she was reported missing. Beyond those basic facts, name, age, date, location, the details that would allow a full reconstruction of her case are not comprehensively documented in sources accessible to the public. There is no extensive media coverage from 1991. There is no documented investigative timeline. There is no publicly named person of interest, no official theory on record, no confirmed last sighting with a witness account attached to it. That sparseness is not neutral. It is a fact about her case that carries its own weight. Here's the critical detail about the setting. Because Paradise Valley in 1991 is not a place where a disappearance should vanish into administrative silence. The neighborhood had resources. The city had resources. An adult woman reported missing from one of Arizona's most affluent communities in the summer of 1991 was not a case that should have been difficult to begin investigating. The infrastructure of a wealthy suburb, the neighbors who are home during the day, the density of social connections, the financial capacity to sustain a search, the proximity to the investigative resources of the Phoenix metro area. All of that was present. And yet 33 years later, the public record on Sherry Doerty amounts to a name, a date, and a location. Now this is where the case turns dark. Not through dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of what isn't there. In 1991, Paradise Valley did not have the surveillance infrastructure that exists today. There were no ubiquitous doorbell cameras, no automatic license plate readers on every major intersection, no digital trail created by a cell phone broadcasting its location to a network every few minutes. The investigative tools that have transformed missing persons cases in the decades since. The ability to reconstruct a person's movements through their digital footprint, to pull cell tower data, to access surveillance footage from a dozen angles on any given block. None of those existed in August 1991. A disappearance in that era left behind only what physical evidence and human witnesses could document. And if neither of those produced immediate leads, the case could go cold before the investigative machinery had time to generate traction. But here's what doesn't make sense. And it is a different kind of contradiction than the ones that run through the wilderness cases earlier in this episode. In the Grand Canyon and the Superstition Mountains, the absence of answers has a physical explanation that is coherent even if it is not satisfying. The terrain is vast. The conditions are extreme. The landscape actively resists the preservation and discovery of evidence. Those cases are mysterious, in spite of the fact that we understand broadly what the wilderness can do to a person and why it is so difficult to find someone it has taken. The mystery is in the specifics, not in the framework. Sherry Doerty disappeared from a suburb, from a neighborhood with streets and houses and neighbors and the ambient social infrastructure of a community where people know each other, notice things, talk. The framework that applies to wilderness disappearances does not apply here. A 28-year-old woman does not vanish from Paradise Valley, Arizona in August 1991 because the terrain swallowed her. Something specific happened, in a specific place, on a specific day. Something that involved other people or decisions or circumstances that existed in the ordinary human world of a wealthy Phoenix suburb. And 33 years of silence suggests that whatever that something was, it has never been surfaced in any form that produced a public answer. The database entries for Sherry Doerty note that the last known location in some records is listed as the Apache Junction area rather than Paradise Valley itself, a detail that suggests she may have been mobile in the period leading up to or around the time of her disappearance, though the specifics of that detail are not fully documented in accessible sources. Apache Junction sits at the base of the Superstition Mountains, the same terrain that took Jesse Capen in 2009 and Curtis Merworth, Ardian Charles, and Malcolm Meeks in 2010. Whether that geographic detail is meaningful to understanding what happened to Sherry Doerty, or whether it is simply an artifact of how her case was entered into database records, is not something the public record can clarify. What the public record can say is this: she was 28 years old. She disappeared in the summer. She has not been found. No remains have been publicly reported as recovered and identified as hers. No person has been publicly named in connection with her disappearance. No resolution has been reported in any accessible source in 3 decades. The theory space in Sherry Doerty's case is genuinely narrow, because the evidence base that would allow responsible theorizing simply does not exist in the public record. The 2 broad categories of explanation that apply to any adult disappearance, voluntary departure and foul play, are both technically possible, and neither is supported by specific evidence that is publicly available. The sparse documentation does not allow for the kind of specific contradiction analysis that the other cases in this episode permit. There is no intact boat to analyze, no note in a glass jar on a mountaintop, no computer search history, no fire that burned the search corridor 1 week in. There is just a name in a database and a date and 33 years of no answer. And that absence, that specific, sustained, complete absence of resolution, is its own category of disturbing. Because it means that somewhere in the ordinary human world of a Phoenix suburb, in a summer month in 1991, something happened to a 28-year-old woman that has produced no answer in 3 decades. Not for lack of time, not for lack of the general investigative infrastructure that surrounds a major American metro area. Something happened that has stayed hidden in a place where hiding things is not supposed to be easy. The wilderness cases in this episode are disturbing because they demonstrate what terrain and distance and heat and cold can do to a person, and what they can do to the prospect of ever finding out what happened to them. Sherry Doerty's case is disturbing for the opposite reason. There was no wilderness. There was no extreme terrain. There was no 160,000-acre volcanic range or 277-mile canyon to search. There were streets and houses and a community, and a metro area with investigative resources, and an adult woman who has been missing for 33 years anyway. Paradise Valley, August. The streets quiet and clean in the way of places where money has bought distance from disorder. A 28-year-old woman. And then nothing. No trace, no resolution, no answer from a place that should have had all of them. The last case, the quietest case, the one that doesn't have the dramatic backdrop of a canyon wall or a volcanic mountain range to explain why the silence has lasted so long. Just a suburb, just a summer, just a woman who was there and then was not, in one of the safest looking places in Arizona, and has not been found in 3 decades of looking. 33 years is a long time to wait for an answer from a place like Paradise Valley. The canyon, at least, has the decency to look like somewhere a mystery could live. A quiet street in a wealthy Phoenix suburb is supposed to be the kind of place where things get resolved, where the infrastructure of community and resources and proximity to investigative capacity means that questions get answered. Sherry Doerty's case is a reminder that disappearances do not require wilderness. They do not require extreme terrain or extreme weather or the specific indifference of a mountain range that has been taking people for 100 years. They require only a moment and a silence that follows it, and enough time for that silence to become permanent. 10 cases, 10 places in Arizona. And now we come back to where we started, to the map, to the state, to the specific geography of all of it laid out together. Because when you place these 10 disappearances on a map of Arizona and look at where they cluster and what connects them, the picture that emerges is not random. And the closing image of this episode is not a resolution. It is the map itself, and what it says about a state that has been keeping secrets for a very long time. Pull up that map. Not the tourist map. Not the one with the scenic byways highlighted in yellow and the national park boundaries drawn in green and the major highways labeled for easy navigation. The other map. The one where you put a dot on every place a person walked in and didn't walk back out. Do that for Arizona, using just the 10 cases in this episode. And look at what you have. 3 dots on the Superstition Mountains, clustered in the volcanic terrain 60 miles east of Phoenix. Jesse Capen, who drove 15 hours from Denver with a secret he had kept for years and left his water and his wallet in his Jeep and was found 3 years later in a crevasse half a mile from where he started. Kaiman Welch, who stepped away from a scenic overlook on the way, home from work and left his phone in the vehicle, and was absorbed into 2.9 million acres of desert wilderness without leaving a single thread behind. Curtis Merworth, Ardean Charles, and Malcolm Meeks, 3 men from Utah who went in together in the late season and were found in January when the mountains had finished with them. 3 separate events, 3 separate years, the same mountain range, the same legend pulling people toward the same terrain over and over, with the same result. 4 dots along the Grand Canyon corridor, strung out across the Colorado River and the backcountry above it. Glenn and Bessie Hyde, whose boat came back without them in 1928, and whose bodies have not been found in 96 years. Morgan Heimer, who was standing on the riverbank at Pumpkin Springs in full view of his clients and was simply not there when someone looked back. Jong Yan Juan, whose only evidence of presence was a car in a parking lot that nobody noticed for long enough that the window had already closed. Floyd Roberts, who had experience and a plan and companions and a meeting point and walked away from his group anyway and never arrived. And then the other 3, the dots that don't cluster with the wilderness, that sit in the populated parts of the state and complicate any simple story about Arizona's terrain being the explanation for all of it. A dot on Pepper Sauce Canyon near Oracle, where Randy Doyle Parcell Jr. was 10 years old and hiking with his family and was separated from them in April 1979 and has never been found. A dot on a residential street in Mesa, where Mindy Chambers was 17 and had just reported abuse to police and walked 2 blocks toward a school on a Monday morning in October 1982 and left her purse and her ID behind and was not reported missing for 13 years. A dot on Paradise Valley, where Sherry Doerty was 28 years old in the summer of 1991 and disappeared from one of the wealthiest, safest-looking neighborhoods in the state and has not been found in 33 years. Look at the map, all of it together. Here's the critical detail about what that map shows, and it is not a detail about individual cases. It is a detail about the state itself. Arizona has more unidentified sets of human remains per capita than almost any other state in the country. The figure that investigators and researchers have cited publicly is over 1,300 unidentified sets of remains on file in Arizona. Bodies found in the desert, in the canyons, along the border corridors, in the wilderness areas, in the places where the state's specific geography creates the conditions for people to disappear and for the evidence of what happened to them to dissolve before anyone finds it. The Arizona public media outlet AZPM reported years ago that investigators working cold cases for missing and unidentified persons in the Phoenix Police Department alone were carrying cases dating back to the 1940s. The National Missing and Unidentified Person System has consistently ranked Arizona among the states with the highest rates of unresolved cases. The 10 people in this episode are not outliers. They are points on a curve that runs through the entire history of the state. Now this is where it stops being a collection of individual tragedies and becomes something else. A pattern that the geography of Arizona seems almost designed to produce and sustain. The wilderness areas are vast enough to absorb a person completely and resist the most sophisticated search operations modern technology can mount. The border geography adds a dimension of complexity that compounds the jurisdictional challenges of investigations that cross county lines and tribal lands. The desert climate preserves some things and destroys others in ways that are not predictable and not controllable. The heat that kills people in the Superstitions and the Grand Canyon in summer is the same heat that destroys the physical evidence of what happened to them. The cold that took Curtis Merworth and Ardian Charles and Malcolm Meeks in the Superstitions in winter is the same cold that compresses the search windows available to the teams trying to find them. And then there are the cases like Mindy Chambers and Sherry Doerty, which demonstrate that the wilderness explanation is not sufficient to account for all of it, because Arizona's disappearances do not stay in the backcountry. They happen on school routes in Mesa suburbs and on quiet streets in Paradise Valley, and in the ordinary geography of a state that is not, in those places, asking anything dangerous of the people who live there. Those disappearances require a different explanation, one that lives in human behavior and human decision-making and the specific circumstances of individual lives. And the absence of that explanation in those cases is a different kind of silence than the silence of a canyon or a mountain range. It is the silence of something that happened in a place where it should have been seen and was not, or was seen and not reported, or was reported and not investigated with the urgency it deserved. Mindy Chambers walked her stepsister to school in the same month that an ordinary American suburb where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen failed her completely. She has been missing for 42 years and was not even reported for 13 of them. That silence is not the Grand Canyon silence. It is a human silence, chosen or neglected. And it is in some ways harder to sit with than the silence of a wilderness that simply does not care. Kaiman Welch's mother cannot look at his photographs without feeling the specific trauma of not knowing. Glenn and Bessie Hydes' families received nothing to close around. No confirmation, no remains, no final answer. Only a floating boat and 96 years of theories that never resolve. Jesse Capen's mother asked a search and rescue team to keep looking for her son every weekend for 3 years, and they did. And that is why she eventually got her answer. An incomplete answer, a skeleton in a crevasse half a mile from where he started. But an answer nonetheless. Most of the families in this episode have not gotten that much. But here's what doesn't make sense. And it is the question that the map, looked at whole, forces you to ask. These 10 cases span from 1928 to 2020. They cover almost a century of disappearances across every category of setting and circumstance that Arizona offers. Canyon, wilderness, river, suburb, mountain, street, experienced hikers and unprepared ones, adults with plans and children with their families, people who were alone, and people who were surrounded by others. The one thing they share is the state. The one thing they share is Arizona. And Arizona's specific capacity to take people and keep what it takes and return almost nothing. 6 million people visit the Grand Canyon every year. Millions more move through the Superstition Mountains, the Phoenix metro area, the desert corridors of the state on any given day. Most of them go home. They do not think about the map, about the dots, about the 1,300 sets of unidentified remains that Arizona currently has on file. They see the saguaros at dusk and the canyon walls turning gold in the afternoon light, and the highway cutting through the silence, and it is beautiful. And they go home, and that is the whole story. But the map is still there. The dots are still there. Kaiman Welch is still out there in 2.9 million acres of Tonto National Forest, or whatever the superstition fire left behind of the place he walked into. Glenn and Bessie Hyde are still somewhere in the Colorado River, or the canyon walls above it, or the silence of a theory that has never been tested and cannot be. Mindy Chambers has been missing from a Mesa suburb for 42 years. Randy Parcell has been missing from Pepper Sauce Canyon for 46. Sherry Doerty has been missing from one of the safest-looking neighborhoods in Arizona for 33. Something happened here. In a lot of places, at a lot of different times, across almost a century of a state that has always been better at keeping secrets than giving them back. The terrain is part of it. The climate is part of it. The scale of the wilderness is part of it. And some of it, the cases that happened on sidewalks and school routes, in suburbs where the infrastructure of ordinary life was fully present and functioning. Some of it is something else entirely, something that the terrain cannot explain and the climate cannot account for. Something that lives in the space between what people saw and what they said, between what was reported and when, between what was investigated and what was not. Pull up that map one more time. Look at where the dots are. Look at how many of them have no answer next to them, only a name and a date and a location and a silence that has lasted, in some cases, for nearly 100 years. Lock your doors. The desert does not explain itself. It never has.